I'm Lila Dawson. I'm 27 years old. Last week I received the most shocking news of my life. My reclusive Aunt Margot had passed away, and in her will, she left me everything. An estate worth over $15 million, including her sprawling mansion, several businesses, and a collection of investments that would secure my future beyond anything I had ever imagined. I sat in my small apartment, the official letter shaking in my hands, unable to process what it truly meant. $15 million. A mansion that seemed lifted from the pages of a magazine. A life that until now I had only dreamed of. I grew up in foster care after my parents abandoned me at the age of 12. Thrown into a system that was supposed to protect children but often failed to nurture them. I had learned early on that relying on others would only let me down, and so I built myself a life of independence, grit, and quiet determination. I had always hoped for a family that cared. But reality taught me that love sometimes has conditions, and blood is not always enough to guarantee it. And yet, this letter from Aunt Margot, someone I barely knew, offered something that seemed impossibly generous, almost unreal. Along with the inheritance there was a personal letter from Aunt Margot herself. Her handwriting, elegant yet deliberate, made my heart race as I read each carefully chosen word. She explained that she had watched over me from afar, aware of my struggles and achievements, and that she had deliberately excluded my parents from any part of her fortune because of the cruelty and neglect they had shown. The letter hinted at a clause in the will designed to test me should my parents try to appear after so many years, and it made me both nervous and strangely empowered. Aunt Margot's words were a blend of warmth and strategy, a combination of love and foresight that left me feeling protected and challenged at the same time. "Remember, Lila," she had written, "the measure of a person is not in what they are given but in how they handle what comes to them, and how they respond to those who wish to take it from them." The first person I told about the inheritance was my foster sister Camilla, who had been with me through the roughest years of my life. Her eyes lit up as she hugged me tight, a mixture of excitement and disbelief on her face. "Lila, this is amazing. You deserve this, every bit of it," she said, her voice trembling slightly. But then she lowered her tone, adding, "But be careful, money has a way of bringing out the worst in people. You know your parents. I wouldn't be surprised if they show up." I nodded, trying to keep my mind steady. But the warning lingered. 15 years of abandonment left scars deeper than I liked to admit. And even though I had built a strong life, the idea of facing them again, especially now, was both infuriating and frightening. The day the estate documents arrived, I went to Aunt Margot's mansion for the first time. The estate was breathtaking, a mix of classic elegance and modern luxury, with gardens that seemed endless and halls that echoed with quiet grandeur. I walked through the rooms slowly, imagining the life my aunt had built in secret, and feeling the weight of the responsibility she had entrusted to me. Each room contained pieces of her personality, books carefully arranged by genre, paintings that spoke of her tastes, and letters tucked in drawers that hinted at a meticulous mind. In one of the rooms I found a hidden compartment behind a bookshelf, where Aunt Margot had stored journals and letters that seemed to serve as a personal guide for me. It was like she was leaving breadcrumbs, a map of wisdom and strategy, ensuring that I would not only inherit wealth but also inherit knowledge about navigating the treacherous waters of family and society. By the evening I was exhausted but exhilarated. I sat on the balcony overlooking the estate gardens, holding Aunt Margot's letter and letting the words sink in. I thought about my past, about the small apartment I had struggled to maintain, the foster homes that had felt like temporary prisons, and the parents who had chosen their freedom over me. And now, suddenly, I was being thrust into a world they could only dream of entering, a world where I had the power to decide who belonged in my life, and who remained outside. As I watched the sunset, I realized that this inheritance was not just money or property. It was a chance for justice, a tool to protect myself, and an opportunity to define my family on my own terms. And yet there was an unease lingering at the edge of my thoughts. Aunt Margot's letter had warned me that some challenges might come disguised as apologies, as regrets, or as innocent curiosity. She had hinted that those who had abandoned me might attempt to return, drawn by greed and the illusion of entitlement. I didn't want to think about them, my parents, but the words stayed with me like a shadow, a premonition of confrontation. Deep down, I knew that my life was about to change in ways even Aunt Margot's foresight could only hint at. I was ready, or at least I hoped I was, to face whatever came next. As the first night in my new home fell, I lay awake listening to the subtle creaks and whispers of the old mansion, the quiet hum of electricity and the rustle of trees outside my window. I felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration, understanding for the first time that I had been given not just wealth but the tools to take control of my destiny. And I knew with a certainty that made my heart beat faster, that the moment my parents stepped into my life again, nothing would ever be the same. I never thought I'd hear their voices again. Not like this. Not after 15 years of silence. Yet one bright morning as the sunlight streamed through the towering windows of my aunt's mansion, there was a knock at the front door. A polite, hesitant knock that instantly sent my heart racing, though not with excitement. I knew that sound, I knew that cadence. It was familiar yet foreign, like a faded melody remembered incorrectly. I opened the door to see them standing there. Jonathan and Marcia Dawson, my parents. Time had aged them, added lines and gray hairs, but their eyes held the same mixture of arrogance and uncertainty that I remembered from my childhood. Their expressions were carefully measured, almost rehearsed, as though they had been preparing this moment for years, waiting for the perfect opportunity to reinsert themselves into my life. "Lila," my father said, his voice low and tentative. We need to talk." My instinct was to slam the door in their faces. My muscles tensed, and my mind flashed back to the countless nights I had cried alone, to the foster homes that smelled of disinfectant and despair, to the holidays spent wondering if anyone out there remembered I even existed. But there was another part of me that had been waiting for this moment, a part sharpened by Aunt Margot's wisdom, a part ready to turn the tables. I forced myself to remain calm, a small controlled smile on my lips. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. "You can talk in the living room." They entered cautiously, glancing around the mansion as if it were their first time seeing wealth in its purest form. I could feel the flicker of greed in their eyes, though they tried to mask it behind polite smiles and carefully chosen words. "Lila, we heard about your inheritance," my mother said, her tone soft, almost fragile. We wanted to congratulate you, and maybe we'd like to reconnect." I laughed quietly, a sound that startled them both. "Reconnect?" I repeated, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. "Do you mean reconnect after 15 years of silence, after leaving me to navigate the world alone?" Their expressions faltered for a brief second, but they quickly recovered. "We were young," my father said. "We made mistakes, we were foolish. But we've changed, Lila. We want to be part of your life again. We want to make amends." I studied them carefully, my mind racing. They spoke of regret and humility, yet every gesture betrayed calculation. The careful way they glanced at the expensive furniture, the way their eyes lingered on the delicate glass ornaments that I knew were irreplaceable. They weren't here out of love, they were here because they smelled opportunity. The smell of $15 million and the possibility of stepping back into the life they had abandoned. For the first few days I kept my distance, letting them settle into the mansion while observing every movement, every word. They offered to help with chores, to meet my staff, to assist in managing some of Aunt Margot's smaller businesses. I nodded and smiled politely, letting them think I was naive, letting them believe they were slowly being welcomed back into my life. But inside I was alert, recording their every action, noting inconsistencies, subtle lies and moments of greed. My mother, Marcia, had taken to wandering into the kitchen and making suggestions about meals and staff schedules, always framing her criticisms as helpful advice. "Oh, Lila, you should really consider hiring someone full-time for the gardens," she would say, her tone saccharine. Aunt Margot would have wanted things done properly. My father, Jonathan, spent hours in the study ostensibly reviewing estate documents, though I knew he was looking for opportunities to manipulate, to find loopholes, or simply to intimidate the accountants. I had Aunt Margot's letter tucked into my purse at all times, rereading it when doubt crept in. "Test them," she had written. "Do not assume sincerity. Watch. Wait, let their true intentions show themselves. Only then will you know who they truly are. And test them." I would. Every conversation, every shared meal, every attempt at charm was carefully scrutinized. One evening, as they sat in the living room laughing at a story my father told about my supposed childhood, I felt a surge of clarity. I would let them believe they were being welcomed, but every step they took, every whisper would be noted. I would expose them, not through confrontation but through patience, through strategy, through the clever application of Aunt Margot's foresight. That night, I set up a series of cameras in the common areas, not to invade privacy but to gather evidence of manipulation and deceit. It felt strange at first, sneaky even, But the longer I watched them, the more I realized it was necessary. They weren't the people they claimed to be. Their charm was a facade, a mask to hide the rot beneath. And as I drifted to sleep in the quiet luxury of my new bedroom, I made a vow: I would not let them take anything from me. My inheritance, my autonomy, or the dignity I had fought so hard to achieve. They had abandoned me once, but this time the power was in my hands. Every word they spoke, every action they took, would be a brick in the fortress I was building around myself. Little did they know the game had already begun, and in this game I was not just a player, I was the master, quietly orchestrating each move, watching their greed become their own undoing. I woke up that morning with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The mansion was quiet, bathed in golden sunlight streaming through the tall windows, and I felt a surge of satisfaction knowing that my parents were downstairs, entirely unaware of the web I was quietly spinning around them. I had decided that direct confrontation would not serve me. Humiliation is a more potent weapon when wielded slowly, with precision. I wanted them to reveal themselves, their true intentions, their greed, their insincerity, on their own. The first step was to create a sense of comfort, a false security. I invited my parents to join me for breakfast, lavishly prepared in the grand dining room that Aunt Margot had designed for formal gatherings. The table was set with delicate china, freshly baked pastries, and the aroma of strong coffee that wafted through the room. I smiled warmly as they took their seats, my expression carefully neutral, betraying nothing. "So, Lila," my father said, his voice oily with practiced charm, "how are you adjusting to everything? This is a lot for anyone to inherit." I nodded, taking a sip of my coffee. "It is, but I've been managing well." Aunt Margot left detailed notes, and I've been following them closely. I emphasized her name, letting it linger. Aunt Margot's influence was omnipresent, unseen but felt, a ghostly reminder that I was never alone in this battle. My mother reached across the table, touching my hand lightly. "We just want to support you, Lila. We've realized so many mistakes, and now that you're thriving, we hope we can be part of your life again." Her eyes glistened with tears, or so she hoped, I believed. I allowed a faint sympathetic smile, but I was far from deceived. Every movement, every word was a calculated performance. The days that followed were a delicate dance. I let them explore the mansion freely, making them believe they were being trusted and welcomed. My parents roamed the grand halls, commenting on the art and the furniture, offering unsolicited advice on household staff, and trying to insinuate themselves into my routines. I let it all happen, silently observing, noting patterns, inconsistencies, and little manipulations. Every word they spoke, every suggestion they made, was carefully recorded in my mind, and when necessary with the discreet cameras I had installed. One afternoon I found them in the study, poring over estate documents that they had no right to see. They were whispering, glancing at me when they thought I wasn't watching, their voices low, calculating. I pretended not to notice, casually walking past, letting the sound of my steps echo softly. I caught phrases, mentions of transferring assets, subtle hints about trying to claim portions of the inheritance. My blood boiled, but I held my composure. Patience was my ally now, and they were rushing headlong into the trap I had laid. I began inviting them to social gatherings under the guise of rebuilding family ties. Local neighbors, business associates, even some journalists whom Aunt Margot had trusted. All were invited to these carefully orchestrated events. At each gathering I fed selective information, allowing my parents to display their greed and manipulative tendencies. They would subtly hint at wanting more than they deserved, drop comments about how families should share wealth, and try to impress others with exaggerated tales of their past struggles and supposed regrets. I watched it all unfold, savoring each slip, each reveal. It was almost like watching a live chess game, and I was 3 moves ahead. My parents didn't realize that every word, every gesture was being documented. By the end of each event, I had accumulated a trove of evidence. Emails they had sent trying to influence my lawyers, conversations with staff where they attempted to manipulate, even moments of petty jealousy when I interacted with friends and acquaintances. One evening, while reviewing the recordings, I stumbled upon something I hadn't expected. A moment of vulnerability in my mother's eyes. A fleeting look of genuine regret buried under layers of manipulation. It was there for only a second, but it told me something important, that they were human, capable of change, but only if they chose it. And yet their greed was stronger, more immediate, I realized that my Aunt Margot had not just left me wealth, she had left me a moral compass, a blueprint for testing not just others but myself. How far would I go? How patient could I be without losing my humanity? I began setting small tests, subtle scenarios to gauge their intentions. I left a briefcase filled with fictitious documents hinting at a hidden bank account, knowing they would be tempted to peek. I mentioned a rare collectible I had supposedly inherited, planting the seed of curiosity. Each time, I watched, listened, and recorded, letting their true colors emerge like petals of a flower under sunlight. And as I stood in the grand hallway one evening, watching them laugh over a shared memory I knew was fabricated, I felt a thrill of empowerment. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was orchestrating, guiding, observing. Every deceitful smile they offered was a confirmation that I was on the right path. Every subtle manipulation they attempted only strengthened my resolve. I had turned my parents' arrival into a stage, a performance where they were the actors and I was the unseen director. Yet, I knew the true test was still ahead. The final act, where patience, strategy, and moral clarity would converge. I could almost hear Aunt Margot's voice in my head, reminding me to wait, to watch, to let their intentions be laid bare before the decisive moment. I would not act hastily. I would let them dig their own graves with words, with greed, with the illusion of reclaimed family ties. By the time the sun set over the estate, painting the mansion in hues of orange and gold, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was no longer just about wealth or inheritance. It was about justice, about reclaiming the life they had once abandoned, about teaching them a lesson in humility and integrity without ever lowering myself to their level. I poured myself a glass of wine, savoring the taste and the knowledge that the game was mine to win. My parents believed they were being welcomed back, but in truth they were walking blindly into the consequences of their past. Guided by my hand, my patience, and the legacy of Aunt Margot. And when the time came, they would see that their sudden interest in me, in my life, in my fortune, had been their undoing. The morning of the celebration arrived with a quiet tension that made my stomach flutter, not with fear but with anticipation. I had spent weeks planning every detail, ensuring that nothing could go wrong. The grand mansion, normally a private sanctuary, had been transformed into a scene worthy of a gala. Flowers in full bloom, golden candelabras casting soft light over polished marble floors, and a long table lined with ornate settings for the guests. Neighbors, business associates, journalists, and a few trusted friends, all invited under the guise of celebrating my new life and reconnecting with family, were buzzing with curiosity. I watched my parents from the top of the grand staircase as they arrived, their eyes widening at the sight of the elaborate setup. I could see the mix of greed and excitement in their expressions, the subtle calculation in every glance, every whispered comment. They thought this was a victory, a chance to showcase their supposed humility and win over the community, to be seen as the loving parents they had neglected to be. Little did they know the stage was set for their downfall. The first hour went smoothly. Laughter filled the air, champagne glasses clinked, and polite conversation hummed like music. My parents took every opportunity to engage with the guests, flaunting the stories of their past struggles, weaving tales of regret and transformation. They were worn, even convincing. But I saw through it all. Every word was carefully constructed, every gesture an attempt to manipulate perception. Then it was time. I stood at the head of the table, letting my gaze sweep across the room, allowing the hum of conversation to die down. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice calm and clear. "Today is a special day, not just because of the celebration, but because I want to share a story, my story, and the story of what true family means." I paused, letting the words hang, the silence amplifying their weight. I started recounting my childhood, the years in foster care, the nights spent wondering why my parents had abandoned me, the struggles, the heartbreak, and the loneliness. I spoke of resilience, of finding strength in adversity, and of the rare kindness of Aunt Margot, who had watched over me from afar. My parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their polished masks beginning to crack under the weight of my words. And then, I continued, my eyes locking on theirs, something unexpected happened. Aunt Margot left me her entire estate, everything she owned, precisely because she recognized my perseverance, my integrity, and my capacity to thrive despite betrayal. She also left instructions, guidelines, if you will, to ensure that those who had caused harm in my life could not simply return and claim what they did not earn. A murmur ran through the guests, as I revealed that the inheritance had been accompanied by detailed conditions, including clauses that specifically protected me from claims by my parents. I could see the flush of panic creeping across their faces. My father's hand twitched. My mother's lips pressed tightly together. They were realizing, perhaps for the first time, that their manipulations had consequences. Then came the moment I had orchestrated for weeks. I played the recordings, discreetly edited and compiled, where they had whispered about accessing funds, attempting to manipulate staff, and plotting how to claim parts of my inheritance. The room fell silent as their voices filled the grand hall, unmasking their deceit for all to hear. Faces of acquaintances, neighbors, and journalists shifted from polite curiosity to shock and, in some cases, disgust. I watched not with glee but with a calm sense of justice, as my parents' carefully constructed personas crumbled. They tried to explain, to deny, but the evidence was irrefutable. Every deceit, every scheme, every moment of hypocrisy was now public. My mother's tears were real this time, but not for remorse, they were for humiliation. My father's anger flared, but it was impotent, trapped by the undeniable truth. The legal safeguard in Aunt Margot's will sealed their fate. Attempts to claim any part of the inheritance would not only fail but would also result in forfeiting even limited visitation rights. I had anticipated every move, every possible loophole, and left nothing to chance. My parents' shock and helplessness were complete. The triumph of justice was absolute. I allowed a moment of silence, letting the weight of the revelation settle. Then I addressed the guests. This isn't just a story about wealth or inheritance. It's a story about integrity, about the choices we make, and about recognizing the difference between love and greed. Today I am fortunate not only to inherit Aunt Margot's estate, but also her wisdom, which reminds me that justice is best served with patience, clarity, and moral courage. My parents slumped in their seats. Defeated, their attempts to salvage dignity evaporated. The guests applauded, some moved to tears, others nodding in quiet admiration. It was not cruelty that had orchestrated this scene, but careful justice, guided by intelligence and patience. After the guests departed, I walked through the mansion, the silence now soothing rather than oppressive. I could feel the weight of victory, but also a deeper understanding of freedom. The past had been acknowledged, justice had been delivered, and I could finally breathe without the shadow of betrayal looming over me. Later that evening, I found a letter waiting on my desk, delivered by Aunt Margot's lawyer. It was brief, but profound. Well done, Lila. You have proven that integrity and patience surpass deception and greed. Your parents' actions were their own undoing. Now, live fully, and continue the legacy you were entrusted to uphold. I held the letter in my hands, a quiet smile spreading across my face. The ultimate exposure had not just revealed the truth to the world. It had revealed it to me, affirming my strength, my wisdom, and my ability to navigate the complexities of life, without losing myself. The mansion, the wealth, the carefully executed plan, it was all secondary to the clarity and empowerment I now possessed. And as I looked out over the estate, bathed in the soft glow of twilight, I realized that the real victory was not in the exposure itself, but in the knowledge that I had taken control of my life, my destiny, and my future. The legal aspect comes into play. The will's clause ensures that if the parents try to claim anything, they forfeit even visitation rights to certain parts of the estate, which I execute flawlessly. And just like that, the weight I had carried for 15 years, the anger, the longing, the uncertainty began to lift. It wasn't immediate, not like flipping a switch, but there was a lightness to my chest I hadn't felt since childhood. My parents had always held a strange kind of power over me. The power of abandonment, the power of absence, the power to make me question my worth. But now, with every eye that had witnessed their humiliation and every piece of evidence proving their deceit, that power dissolved completely. I was free. The mansion settled into quiet, a silence that felt almost sacred. I wandered through the grand halls, letting my fingers trace the banisters and the polished wooden surfaces, thinking of Aunt Margot and the years she had quietly watched over me. It struck me, even now, that her guidance hadn't only been in the fortune she left. It was in the subtle ways she had prepared me to see through lies, to recognize manipulation, and most importantly to act without malice, but with precision. Every decision I made against my parents had been under her invisible hand. I realized then that this inheritance wasn't just wealth, it was a test of character, one I had passed. I had always thought that receiving Aunt Margot's fortune would be about luxury, about comfort after a lifetime of struggle. But as I walked through the mansion's expansive gardens and smelled the faint perfume of roses she had planted decades ago, I understood it was about legacy. The real gift was the opportunity to take the past, the pain and the absence of love, and turn it into something greater than mere survival. I could create impact, not just for myself, but for others who had suffered similar losses. The first step was obvious. The children I had grown up alongside in foster care, the ones who had been abandoned, overlooked or underestimated, they needed what I had never had. I began forming the Margot Foundation for Children, dedicating resources to mentorship, education, and safe housing. I wanted to ensure that no child would feel the despair I had at 12, when my parents walked out. The foundation was small at first, but I immersed myself in its operations, personally mentoring children, organizing programs, and connecting with volunteers. Watching their eyes light up with hope was a joy I had never anticipated. Every smile, every spark of ambition became a mirror reflecting what I had endured and what I had now transformed into strength. In the mansion, I also began tending to the smaller joys I had neglected. The library, once silent and imposing, became my sanctuary. I spent hours reading Margot's personal diaries, which were more than records. They were lessons, guidance on how to live with integrity, patience, and courage. Each entry revealed her thoughts on resilience, kindness, and strategy, subtly preparing me for the very moment I had just lived through. The realization struck me. Aunt Margot had known I would triumph not through brute force or vengeance alone, but through careful observation, morality, and measured action. I redecorated a few rooms not for extravagance but to create spaces for reflection, creativity, and learning. One corner of the mansion became my studio. I painted, journaled, and meditated, reclaiming hobbies and joys that had been buried under years of survival mode. Walking through the gardens at dusk, feeling the sun's final warmth on my skin, I understood something profound. Freedom was not just legal or financial. Freedom was emotional, mental, and spiritual. And I had finally claimed it in every sense. Months passed, and the world outside the mansion seemed quieter in comparison to the battles I had fought within these walls. My parents had disappeared entirely from my life, retreating into their shame and irrelevance. Occasionally I would hear rumors that they were attempting to rebuild their lives, but none of it touched me. Their attempts at reconciliation or revenge had no power over me. The only thing they had ever truly given me was motivation, and I had turned it into a life I owned completely. One afternoon, as I sorted through some of Aunt Margot's letters and legal documents, a small envelope arrived from her law firm. I recognized the elegant script immediately, and felt a flutter of excitement. Inside was a personal letter, folded neat. Dear Lila, if you are reading this, you have done exactly what I hoped you would. You have taken the inheritance, but more importantly you have taken the lesson. Patience, wisdom, and integrity triumph over deception and greed. I always knew you had the strength to not only survive, but to thrive. Remember, true wealth is not in gold, but in the lives you touch, the legacy you build, and the person you become. With all my love and pride, Margot. Tears sprang to my eyes. Her words, though written years ago, felt as present as ever. I had not only inherited her fortune, I had inherited her faith in me, her vision for what I could become. It wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about purpose, growth, and creating meaning from everything I had endured. And I did. The foundation expanded rapidly, supporting dozens of children, helping them find homes, education, and mentorship. I held workshops, hosted retreats, and shared my story, teaching resilience and self-worth. I became a mentor, a protector, and an advocate, transforming my wealth into a force that could reshape lives. Every child I helped, every program I launched, every dream I nurtured became a tribute to Aunt Margot, and a declaration that I had conquered the past not with anger but with action. At night I would often sit on the balcony, gazing over the gardens and the horizon beyond. The mansion, once a symbol of a complicated inheritance, had become a beacon of possibilities. I had learned to forgive, not my parents who had long forfeited that privilege, but myself, for allowing the past to shape me into something stronger, wiser, and unbroken. I realized finally that the real inheritance wasn't money. It was independence, clarity, and the power to choose my path. The mansion, the foundation and even the memories of betrayal were merely vessels for the life I had crafted. I was no longer a child left behind. I was Lila, guardian, visionary, and creator of my own destiny. And in that quiet, victorious moment, I smiled, understanding at last what Aunt Margot had always known. I had not only inherited a fortune, but I had inherited my own life, and nothing, not abandonment, deceit, or greed could ever take it from me.